Hi everyone. I am going to spend some time explaining annotation, which is a critical reading process that I use a lot in my classroom. Annotation serves quite a few different purposes. First off, by the time students get to me, they've become fairly efficient at reading everything as fast as we can read it. And if you're reading quickly, you don't always connect to the details of a story. You're not always paying attention to things that might make the story more interesting or make themes show up later in the story. So I need to slow you down so that you're really thinking about what's happening to the characters and what's happening in the story as we go. The second reason that we annotate is the more thinking that you can do as you read the story the first time through especially, then the less you have to go back and review the story. So take for granted that most of the time when a teacher in an English classroom asks you to read a story, the next step is going to be you need to write something about the story, whether you're writing an essay about a character or a theme from the story, or you're trying to understand some type of metaphor or that the story is creating. Any of those things require that you have specific text. So text evidence is a really important part of analyzing a story. If you want to say a story is about something, then you're going to have to find pieces of text, sentences that tell you it's about that. And the more carefully I can get you to read and identify those pieces of text that are interesting to you, the easier it will be later to write the essay. So we really use this as a reading strategy, but it's also the initial step in a writing strategy to help you get through the writing process. And I teach annotation in a fairly detailed manner. The main reason that I do that is that for most of you, I'm the first teacher that you've had that has done annotation with you. Lots of high school teachers and college teachers use annotation. So I want you to have a really good example of here is how I annotate so that you are able to do it on your own and do it well enough that you can pull out themes and ideas to write your own essays. So annotation is a process that requires that we do lots of thinking while we read. So we're going to work on a sample story that I use a lot in my classroom. It's called A Walk in the Dark. And when you're annotating, there are three main modes that we look for when you begin annotating. You're going to write down questions. And you don't want to write down questions just as they show up in your head, because most readers, by the time they get to me, have reached a point where they really don't think much when they read. So questions don't naturally pop up into your mind. Instead, you have to make yourself ask questions as you read the text. Anything that the author doesn't explain all the way, anything that seems contrary to a different part of the story, you want to ask questions as frequently as you can, because the best essays come from really good questions. The second part of that is you want to pay attention to connections. Anytime the author is describing something you already know something about because you've learned it in life or you've read about it in another story, you want to write down that connection so that you can refer to it later. Often characters are modeled after other characters, and so lots of times we can get ideas about what message is the author trying to portray with their writing by understanding those character connections. And then the last thing that you get to write down are comments. And comments you have to be a little bit careful about. These are when you are writing down opinions, what you think about what's going on in the character's world or the storyline that's happening. Sometimes opinions can just be sarcastic commentary. And when you do that, it may make the story more entertaining to you, but often you can't use that information when you write an essay. So you want to try and keep your comments as text-based as you can, keeping in mind that we're trying to pick good evidence, trying to find sentences where the author's saying something that we think might be important, because that's what we're going to use when we write an essay. And generally speaking, keep in mind, anytime that you read, the next step for most English teachers is they want you to write something about it. So you have to understand how can you write about a theme, or how can you write a character analysis based on what you've read in the story. So this is our sample story that we're going to use. It's called A Walk in the Dark by Arthur C. Clarke, and I use this story a lot with my students. And we're just going to start at the beginning, and I'm going to annotate and kind of walk you through my thinking while I annotate. So when I annotate in my classroom, we use lots and lots of colors. There's no rhyme or reason to the way colors work in annotation. I simply use lots of colors because I want to keep one comment separate from another, so that if I have to kind of squeeze my writing in, which I do often because I write so much, I can tell where one comment ends and the next one begins. So I'm going to start at the very beginning sentence. And at first, when I start reading a story, I annotate basically per sentence. Once you get further into the story, then you can read an entire paragraph, go back and annotate that. But you don't want to read too much, because if you read on, then your brain doesn't want to take the time to go back and write. So you kind of have to balance how much do I read so that I'm thinking things, but not reading ahead so far that I'm unwilling to go back. So here's how the start of it works. I look at the first sentence. Robert Armstrong had walked just over 2 miles, as far as he could judge, when his torch failed. So I have a couple of questions about that. I can tell from this picture that this looks like a space guy. Plus, if you've been in my class, you know this is a space essay because I've talked to you about that. So the name Robert Armstrong makes me think something. It's a connection that I have. So I know Robert Armstrong seems familiar because the name Armstrong is important. So I would write Armstrong. And the Armstrong that I'm thinking of is Neil Armstrong. So I would wonder, is Neil Armstrong somehow related to this topic? Is that what my brain's thinking of? So I might just write down related to Neil Armstrong. And if you know about Neil Armstrong, you probably know that he was the first man to walk on the moon. So if this is a space story, it would make sense that maybe Neil Armstrong might be referenced. So in order to understand that, I have to be able to look at something about the context of the story. And the context that I want you to remember for this story was that the story was written in 1950. So if this was a copyright of 1950, so I'm going to put that in. Neil Armstrong landed on the moon in let me write this down, 1969, just to make sure I'm right. So if he didn't land on the moon until 69, and this story was written in 1950, we've got 19 years gap from when it was written before Neil Armstrong lands on the moon. So there probably isn't a connection here. It's unlikely that Arthur C. Clarke thought 19 years before that Neil Armstrong would end up there. So I'm going to write not connected. And I might write something like timeline is too far apart. And I just kind of write my comments wherever I can fit them. And so lots of times I write them sideways, I write them in the margin, I draw lines quite often to where I want to put my text. You'll see that I underline text a lot. I put words in boxes so that I can remember what text I'm connecting to. Annotation is much more effective if you're connecting it to specific words or sentences, because later those sentences are going to be the evidence that I want to cite in my paper. So I don't want to just write in the margin and not connect back to the text. Otherwise, it doesn't really help me with trying to find those evident sentences. So I would keep reading from, or keep thinking about this sentence from here. Had walked just over 2 miles. So I'm going to say, I wouldn't want to walk that far. So, and it's perfectly okay for you sometimes to interject your own personality into an annotation. What is the character going through that you understand or you don't understand or that you want more ideas on? When his torch failed. So that leaves me with a question. Like, my main question is, how did it fail? Which I might find more out as I read, so I'm just going to write that question down and leave it. He stood still for a moment, unable to believe that such a misfortune could really have befallen him. Okay, so anytime a word seems strange to you, you want to make sure that you identify that word, and this is usually where I draw boxes. So I think the word befallen is a bit of an odd word. It's not a word that we see that often in text. We certainly don't use it in today's society. So I am going to look it up, but I already looked it up so that this wouldn't take as much time. And I'm going to think that befallen means happen. So he is thinking that he can't believe that this event has happened to him. So I'm going to write, why can't he believe it? I mean, it seems like he's getting kind of dramatic over just a torch going out. Then, half maddened with rage, he hurled the useless instrument away. So I'm going to say, I think this is a really strong descriptor, half maddened. So my comment might be, why would he get so mad at that? Rage is a pretty strong word to use. Authors usually pick their words very, very carefully. And so when we analyze, we also want to think about why that word. Why is the author thinking that word's the word that we would choose to describe this? So why would he get so mad? Then it says, not only did he get mad, he hurled the useless instrument, which we're going to talk about. Hurled means threw, so I might write that down just so that I remember that he's throwing this. And this whole idea here makes me think he has a temper. So I'm going to write Armstrong must have a temper. And if I think that that is true, and I'm thinking I may have to write a character paper, this may be my characterization that I want to go through. The rest of the story as I read, I might just be paying attention to when does he act angry so that I can find pieces of evidence for that temper that's showing up here. I think useless instrument is pretty telling. I'm guessing that he's talking about the torch here, so I'm going to write the torch. And then I'm going to ask another question, or maybe say a statement. I don't know that a lot of people would just throw that instrument away. I think they would kind of find some use for it, like a MacGyver type use. He doesn't seem like a MacGyver type. He just throws it away. So I'm going to write not like MacGyver. And if you're too young for that reference, go do some film research on MacGyver, great TV character. So I'm going to put that there, probably spelled wrong. That's MacGyver. MacGyver, there we go. So that might be a connection that you could make. I'm going to move over to the next column and keep doing the same thing. Every sentence, I want to think something about the text. It landed somewhere in the darkness, disturbing the silence of this little world. So this is my first cue in the text to darkness. So I might ask some questions about that. First, I might say, why is it dark? We know that darkness is a part of this story because of the title, A Walk in the Dark. But does this mean that it's nighttime? Does it mean something else, like the power is out? So I might write nighttime with a question mark, power out, question mark. One of the things that you'll notice up here, see how I now have this annotation, commentary, and then I have these questions. See how I use the same color and they're kind of blending into each other? That's why I rotate my colors. Because by the time I get all the writing done, I want to make sure I can tell where one thought goes and compares to another thought. So normally I would try not to do this where I have two colors right next to each other. Disturbing the silence of the little world. So I want to ask how little. Like, is this like an Earth-sized world? Is it a different world? So I'm not sure how small this is. Best case scenario, anytime that you write your comments out here, you want to try and use different words than the words the author used. So I could say how little, because they use the word little, but instead I'm going to write small. So try and think of a synonym instead when you write your annotation. And the reason that we do that is that when we start to write the essay, you're going to have to use the sentence for evidence. So the sentence would already have little world in it. When I write my interpretation, which is that follow-up sentence, I don't want to use the word little again. So if I've already thought of another word that I could use when I write my interpretation, I'll be better off. So the more synonyms you can get into your annotation instead of choosing the exact word from the text, the better off you are. A metallic echo came ringing back from the low hills. So that gives me a couple of thoughts. Like, one, if there's a metallic echo, then that means the torch must be made out of metal. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a metallic echo. So I'm going to write, so the torch is metal. Now this definitely changes the mental image that I have of it, because originally I was thinking of kind of like a wood torch that would have like a flaming cloth on the top of it. That doesn't seem to be what we're talking about here, because he says when he throws it, it's metallic. Also, another one of those would be if your torch fails that way, you'd still have kind of like a club. I'm not sure you would throw it away. So for some reason, he's thinking it's useless at this point. And because it came ringing back, what that is talking about, so I'm going to underline ringing back, that's talking about an echo. And echoes tell us something important about the landscape. It may mean that that area that he's in is in some kind of valley or bowl, because that's what it would take for an echo to happen. So I'm going to say he is in a low point in the terrain, maybe. Terrain is a good word. I try and think of good words while I annotate, because I know that those words are words that I could use later when I write my essay. From the low hills. And so we know if we have low hills, I might have another question. Can he see over these hills? Like, how low of hills are we talking about? Then all was quiet again. Okay, so that gives me a few thoughts. My first thought is if it's quiet after he makes that racket, there must not be much around. It must just kind of be him. So that might be important. So I could say, is it only him out there? Because you would think that metallic racket would make something else move or stir, unless there wasn't anything there. Then I'm moving on to the next paragraph. This, thought Armstrong, was the ultimate misfortune. Okay, so I'm going to switch colors again because my colors are starting to blend. Ultimate misfortune, I think, is a pretty dramatic sentence. So I'm going to write, how dramatic? Is it really that bad? So I know that this isn't a ton of annotation. I didn't want to make the video too long, but here's what I want you to see. When you annotate, what you are trying to do is think. All the possible thinking that you could get done on a story, and realize in the first page, a lot of those thoughts are just questions because you don't know what's going on in the story yet. As you read more and more of the story, you want your annotations to get much longer and more thorough. And so I'm going to show you some different annotations just so that you can see kind of the depth of how they grow. So here's an example, same page of A Walk in the Dark, where you see the things that this class happened to think about while we were annotating. Then when we get further into the story, this is what it starts to look like. Look at all that thinking that's going on. And you'll notice that when I can, I try and connect a specific word to a specific comment that I have, and I'm rotating the colors so that they don't run into each other. If it's a vocabulary word, I definitely am putting a box around it. If it's something I don't recognize, I often underline or I circle things if I'm trying to make connections to them. And I'm trying to keep a line between here is the text that made me think something and here's my thought. Later, when I go back and I'm writing the essay, I'm going to have to find, here's a sentence that I think matters, that I have purple for. And then I'm going to have to find the purple thought that goes with that, because that's going to help me write my evidence and my interpretation sentence when I'm working on my essays. So this is kind of what annotation looks like in the long strand. Not all teachers require annotation in this much depth, and you'll find that as you get into high school and college, when teachers ask you to annotate on your own, they're expecting you to read a little faster than I am. They're going to want annotation to be faster. So if you need to speed up annotation, the best way to do it is this. As you are reading, if a sentence seems important, highlight that sentence. Then annotate next to the highlighted part why you thought that sentence was important. So highlighting is a good tool to use for annotation, but if all you do is highlight a whole bunch of stuff and you don't write anything down, it's not going to help you that much because you haven't done any of the hard thinking that goes into why is this information important. So the shortcut that I tell kids to do is you highlight a sentence and then you write in the margin what you think about what you highlighted. In a given page like this, I would try and have somewhere between 4 and 5 things that I'd highlighted. So I'm not writing dozens and dozens of things down like I do on a full annotation, but I'm at least trying to highlight what sentences seem important or influential and what my thoughts about those sentences are as I go. Then you can use those highlighted parts to be your evidence, your direct quotes and paraphrases in your essay, and hopefully you can use your annotation thinking to help you build that interpretation sentence. So this is kind of how annotation works in my class. Hopefully that gave you an idea of the process that you're looking at. Again, the most important part of an annotation is that you think a lot while you read. Many people, by the time they get into middle school, high school, college, have learned to just read and blankly stare at the page. Make yourself think lots of things while you read. Remember that you're trying to ask lots of questions about what's going on. You're trying to connect to things you already know and understand. And you're trying to write down opinions that you have about the text. I got to add a T in here. Sometimes I write so fast I don't even finish the word. But that is annotation in a nutshell. Hopefully that kind of helps you and shows you how you could annotate a text to make it more interesting. Obviously, the level of annotation that I have on this model is up to the proficient or advanced level. The difference between proficient and advanced is that proficient tends to have single word thoughts, where advanced has longer thinking, where I can tell you're trying to make connections or trying to understand things beyond what's in the text. So that's the difference between a proficient and an advanced annotation. Partially proficient and novice annotations tend to have less connections. So if you're only connecting with the page once every paragraph, that might be partially proficient. If you're connecting with the page fewer times than that, then you're moving into novice territory. You want to make sure that you're actually writing down the full sentence and full thought that you have, because if you don't, by the time you get back to look at it to write your essay, a lot of times you don't remember why you wrote the things down that you did. So the more complete you can do your annotation, the better off you are when you move into that essay. And what most students find is that once you start annotating and once you start doing all of the thinking that it takes, it's really hard to back off and not read a story in depth. So that's kind of how annotation works. Hopefully this video helps you out a little bit, and we will see you on the next video.